Emma Watson arrived in a remote village as part of her mission to support women's education. Throughout her journey, she had seen the deep-rooted poverty reflected in the cracked earth, makeshift homes, and weary faces. But what caught her attention the most was a little girl crouched near the entrance of the village school. Her clothes were tattered, her feet bare, her frail body shivering in the cold. She looked as if a single gust of wind could carry her away. But what stood out even more was the old, torn notebook clutched tightly in her small hands. She was pressing her ear toward the school's open window, desperately trying to catch the teacher's words from inside. Emma approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. As soon as the girl heard footsteps, she flinched and lowered her head, as if preparing to run away. Kneeling down gently, Emma spoke in a warm, soothing voice. "Hello, sweetheart. What are you doing here?" The little girl slowly lifted her head, her brown eyes filled with both fear and sadness. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm listening to the lessons." Emma noticed her hesitation and smiled, moving a little closer. "But why aren't you inside the classroom?" The girl gripped the edges of her notebook tightly. Her lips trembled, as if she was afraid of the answer she was about to give. "My father won't let me go to school, but I want to learn." The words stabbed at Emma's heart, a child's pure desire to learn, crushed under the weight of outdated beliefs. The light in the girl's eyes was dimming, a flicker of hope struggling to survive. Emma's eyes fell on the notebook. The pages were filled with carefully written, but heavily erased, and rewritten words, scribbles, small notes. The girl had been trying to teach herself to read and write. "Did you write this yourself?" Emma asked, gently brushing her fingers over the worn pages. The girl nodded shyly. "I listen to the teacher's voice. Then I write down whatever I remember." Emma's eyes welled up. While other children her age had colorful notebooks and endless school supplies, this little girl clung to a single old notebook as if it were her greatest treasure. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated at first, then whispered softly, "Kieran." Emma smiled warmly. "Kieran, that's a beautiful name." Just then, the school bell rang. Recess had started. Kieran quickly clutched her notebook to her chest and scrambled to stand up. But in her rush, she lost her balance. Emma instinctively caught her. "Kieran, are you okay?" The girl nodded quickly, but Emma felt the tremor in her fragile body. That's when she realized Kieran wasn't just tired. She was starving. She hadn't had a proper meal in days, maybe even longer. At that moment, a group of students ran outside and noticed them. A few children started whispering and pointing at Kieran. "She's here again. That poor girl always listens from outside. Her father says girls shouldn't go to school. That's why she never comes inside. Even her mother can't do anything about it." Kieran looked away, her cheeks turning red. She gripped her notebook even tighter, taking small steps backward. Emma clenched her fists, anger bubbling inside her. A little girl who wanted nothing more than to learn was being treated like an outcast. And then a shadow loomed over them. Emma looked up to see a tall, stern-looking man glaring at her. Kieran froze in fear and took a step back. The man's sharp eyes locked onto Emma. His voice was cold and demanding. "Who are you?" Kieran's voice was barely audible as she murmured, "My father." Emma realized in that instant, Kieran's biggest obstacle wasn't just cultural norms. It was the very man standing in front of her, a father who controlled his daughter's fate, deciding what she could and couldn't become. And for Emma, this wasn't just about one child. If girls like Kieran were being denied their right to education, then she was ready to fight. That day, Emma Watson took the first step, not just to change one child's future, but to rewrite the destiny of an entire generation. That evening, as Emma spoke with the village women about Kieran, she quickly realized the topic was unwelcome among the men. A small group gathered in the square, and at the center of them stood Kieran's father, his expression hard and unyielding. "Women don't need education," he said sternly. "They marry, do housework, and bear children. What is school good for?" Emma clenched her fists, but maintained her composure. "Kieran wants to learn. She is bright, and with an education, her future could be different." The man let out a harsh laugh. Her future is already set. She will be just like her mother. Emma bit her lip. She knew this conversation wouldn't end here. If she wanted to help Kieran, she had to fight for her. The next day, as she walked past the school, she instinctively searched for Kieran in her usual spot. But the little girl wasn't there. A sinking feeling settled in Emma's chest. As she stepped closer, something on the ground caught her eye. Ashes and charred fragments of paper. Kieran's notebook had been burned. Emma rushed to Kieran's home, her heart pounding. She knocked firmly on the door, and after a few moments, it creaked open. Inside, the dimly lit room was filled with silence. Kieran sat huddled in a corner, her tiny frame shaking. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Beside her, her mother sat quietly, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Emma knelt beside Kieran. "Kieran," she whispered gently. The girl shook her head, holding herself tighter. "My father burned my notebook," she finally murmured. "I can't study anymore." Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. This wasn't just about a notebook. Kieran's father had tried to burn away her hope, her dreams, her future. But Emma wasn't going to let that happen. She took a deep breath and smiled. "We'll fix this. I'll get you a new notebook. And from now on, I'll come here every day and teach you myself." Kieran's teary eyes widened. "Really?" Emma nodded firmly. "Yes, I won't let anyone destroy your dreams." But she had no idea how much her decision would shake the village. Determined not to let Kieran's dream die, Emma gathered the women of the village and proposed an idea: an underground school for girls who were forbidden from attending formal education. They began teaching in secret, meeting in back rooms, under trees, and in hidden corners of the village. The women, many of whom had never been given the chance to learn, became teachers to their daughters. But when Kieran's father found out, he was furious. Storming into the village square, he shouted at Emma, and the women gathered around her. "What do you think you're doing? Women have no business learning these things." Emma stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. "The real crime is denying a child their right to an education," she replied boldly. "Women deserve to read, to write, to be more than what they've been told they can be." His face twisted in rage, and he raised his hand in anger. But before he could speak, an elderly woman from the crowd stepped forward. "Emma is right," she said, her voice strong despite its age. "We deserve to learn." One by one, more voices joined in. Women who had remained silent for years finally spoke up. The tide was turning. Weeks passed, and the secret lessons continued. Slowly but surely, change was taking root. One evening, Kieran approached Emma, clutching something in her hands. It was a notebook, a new one. But when Emma looked closer, she saw that Kieran had pasted the remaining unburned pages from her old notebook inside the first few pages. "This reminds me to never give up," Kieran said softly. Emma's eyes welled up as she hugged the little girl. "You are strong, Kieran, and one day, girls like you will change the world." That day, a new notebook was opened, not just for Kieran, but for every girl who had been told she wasn't meant to learn.